Hello Brainworks, my name is Ash Johnson, and this is my DOM called Don't Let Yesterday Take Up Too Much of Today, a DOM on letting go of the past. My thesis is that moving forward while still learning from the past is imperative because dwelling on the past can stunt emotional growth and prevent you from appreciating and making the most of the present. I have a shortened version of my thesis for you guys to write down right here, which is that moving forward from the past is important because dwelling on the past can prevent you from making the most of the present. Now, before we begin, I think it's important to distinguish the difference in a positive versus negative past. A negative past is more of the trauma side of things, possibly due to a rough upbringing, bad morals instilled in you from a young age, or maybe any sort of newer, more recent traumatic events that you've been through. A positive past is just more of the feeling like you can't measure up to the past, like you can't, no matter what you experience, it will never be as good as what you previously experienced. And a term for this is the good old days. Now, a counter argument I ran into during my research, and that a lot of you might have right now, is that moving on from a positive past isn't hard because it's positive. And I agree with this for the most part. I think that most of the time, moving on from a negative past is going to be harder than moving on from a positive past. However, this presentation isn't meant to compare and contrast the differences. It's only meant to point out how moving on from a positive past is hard in its own right. So let's go back to this phrase, the good old days. Now, whether or not you know this phrase, I'm sure you know its more formal counterpart. Nostalgia is defined as a sentimental longing or wistful affection for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations. Now, 79% of people get nostalgic at least once a week, and this is often triggered by loneliness, meaninglessness, and negative mood. But nostalgia isn't only powerful in how often it's felt, it's also powerful in what it can do to us. Nostalgia can enhance our mood, boost our self-esteem and well-being, it can give people a sense of purpose, and it can help you cope with stress by providing positive memories to buffer against hardship. However, nostalgia in our culture is starting to get more and more popular than ever. If you go onto the internet at any point in the current day, you're bound to see nostalgia edits of the 2000s and 2010s. These edits can include things like social media trends, movies, shows, toys, music, and more. Here are two images I found on the internet of what some of these nostalgic edits could look like. Now, I know we have some older people in the room that probably have no idea what are on these slides, but I would assume that a majority of us in this room grew up and were born in either the 2000s or 2010s. Now, I think this is actually a fairly good example of what nostalgia for our generation should and could look like. However, this next example I'm about ready to show you is the complete opposite. So not only are some of the things on this list a little crazy to be nostalgic about, but 2020 was only 5 years ago, which is crazy because compared to the 2000s and 2010s, that's no time at all. Now, this image is the craziest yet. Summer of 2023 nostalgia. This image has been circulating since 2024, which means that we're at a point where we're nostalgic for things that happened a year ago or even less. So let's look at the statistics of this. 40% of Gen Z longs for eras they never even lived through, while a whopping 70% regularly consumes media from earlier decades. A quote you might hear, you might have heard before, you might not, is, "I was born in the wrong generation." Now, whether you agree with this, I don't. I like everything I have now. I enjoy technology, social media, all of that. But whether or not you agree with this or relate to it or what we can infer from this slide and this slide is that Gen Z is not only obsessed with nostalgia from our generation, but also from previous generations that they didn't even live through as well. But why is this? Why is Gen Z so nostalgic for everything all the time? Well, I think this is because that Gen Z, even the oldest of Gen Z, has spent their formative years or was born in a time where there was massive global events happening. If we go down the list, we can think of a couple. There was the 9/11 attacks in 2001, the 2008 recession, the 2020 pandemic, climate change, which has been going on forever, and many more. Now, all of this paired with the fact that social media is more accessible than ever, along with the internet, would have you assume that Gen Z, being able to see all of this firsthand, has a more negative outlook on the future, leading them to find comfort in the past. I think this quote from the author of Gen Z and Nostalgia really sums up everything I'm trying to say best. For Gen Z, nostalgia offers a way to cope with today's complex pressures and hold on to a vision of simpler times. Now, of this vision of simpler times could also blur your vision of the present. A great example of this would be the book, The Great Gatsby. Now, in this book, the main character, Gatsby, is completely obsessed with this girl, Daisy. She ends up leaving him for a rich man, Tom, so Gatsby makes it his life mission to become rich by any means necessary. When he does, he throws extravagant parties for Daisy, all in hopes that Daisy will show up to one. Now, when confronted with his crazy idea of throwing these parties to try and get back with Daisy, Gatsby says his famous quote, "Can't repeat the past? Why, of course you can." Now, against all odds, this works, and Daisy does go to one of Gatsby's parties, and Gatsby tries to rekindle their relationship, but can't accept the fact that Daisy says that at least at one point, she did love Tom. And a quote from her about this reads, "Even alone, I can't say I never loved Tom." Now, all of this leads in Gatsby's tragic demise, and had Gatsby accepted reality and accepted the present, he would have found that he had a lot to enjoy, like his wealth, his friends, and a future with Daisy, had he just accepted that things wouldn't be exactly the same as they used to be. Gatsby's story reminds me a lot of this quote, which says, "Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it." Now, a past mistake in history we have learned from is the Japanese internment camps in World War II. But in order to understand why these were even put in place, we have to go back a little bit and look at the Pearl Harbor attacks. The Pearl Harbor attack was on December 7th, 1941, and was a result of Japan trying to weaken the enemy. In response to this attack, the president at the time, FDR, started a speech, now known as the Day of Infamy speech, that was meant to rally support for America through an appeal to patriotism, and was made to highlight Japan as the enemy, as we can see from his quote, "Our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger." This speech resulted in Executive Order 9066 being signed by FDR on February 19th, 1942. This order excluded Japanese Americans on the West Coast and resulted in over 120,000 Japanese Americans being sent to these camps, and they were kept from 1942 to 1946. There were also harsh conditions in these camps, such as overcrowdedness, which meant that multiple families were kept in small spaces with minimal furnishing and little privacy. There was also limited food, of which was bad quality, and little to no medical care, which caused massive disease outbreaks. These camps were also often kept in deserts, which led to extreme temperatures, heat waves, and lots of dust. And education was not promised camp to camp, so it depended on which one you were sent to. And when there was education, it was poorly funded and was inadequate and unequal to the education that non-Japanese American kids were getting. Now, these camps were not something that the victims forgot. A quote from one of the survivors, Chi Tomohiro, says, "We were American citizens. We pledge allegiance to the flag every morning. For justice and for freedom for all," they said, but it did not apply to us. This really shows how Japanese Americans were discriminated against. They pledged allegiance to the flag to America like everyone else, but when it came down to it, they were betrayed by the country. Another survivor, George Takei, said, "All men are created equal. We have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but I couldn't quite make that fit with what I knew to be my childhood imprisonment." Now, Japanese Americans were allowed to go and fight in the war, but they were not allowed to join regular troops. Instead, a new troop was made for them called the 442nd Regiment. Now, this troop was primarily made up of Japanese Americans and was actually notoriously known for being one of the best troops at the time, as they succeeded in the rescue of the Lost Battalion, which was a failed mission by lots of other previous units. Because of this feat, they were awarded their 8th presidential unit citation by President Harry S. Truman. And when presenting them with this award, he said, "You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice and have won." Now, sometimes all it takes is a push for things to get better. For the Japanese Americans, it was President Harry S. Truman telling them that they have fought prejudice and have won, and that caused them to escape the harshness and prejudice that once was. This isn't just a human thing, though. We can also see an example of things needing a push to move forward in the form of chemical reactions. There are lots of different types of chemical reactions, such as synthesis, in which 2 or more reactants combine to form a single product, decomposition, in which a single compound breaks down into 2 or more simpler substances, single replacement, in which one element replaces another element in a compound, and double replacement, in which 2 compounds exchange ions, forming new compounds. However, there's one more I haven't mentioned, and I'm going to focus on it here today. Combustion reactions. A combustion reaction is defined as a substance that reacts with oxygen, often producing heat and light. Now, the general form for a combustion reaction is substance plus O2 equals CO2 plus H2O. Here I have an example of this, and on this slide I actually have a visual representation of what this would look like. Now, we talked about things needing a push to move forward, so where does that come into play? Well, combustion reactions need activation energy, or a fuel, to move forward. This substance reacts with oxygen and results in energy being released as heat plus light. These reactants collide, break bond. When reactants collide, they break bonds and form new bonds. Some examples of combustion reactions you might see in real life would be burning wood, gasoline or propane, gunpowder explosions, or fireworks. Now, combustion reactions, as we've just learned, collide with each other and get mixed together in all sorts of ways. But something that is the exact opposite of this is parallel lines. Parallel lines are defined as 2 or more straight coplanar lines that do not intersect. And in order to be a parallel line, you must maintain a constant distance from each other. They have no intersection, an equal distance, and must have the same slope. This symbol here is also used to show what parallel lines are, but we'll get back to that later. Now that we're done learning about parallel lines, let's move on to triangle congruency. Now, the definition of triangle congruency is that all 3 corresponding sides and angles are equal. They always coincide, must have the same shape and size, and must either be able to be slid, rotated, flipped, or turned to become congruent. There's also different types of triangle congruency, like side-side-side congruency, side-angle-side congruency, angle-side-angle congruency, or angle-angle-side congruency. There's also HL, or a hypotenuse leg congruency. Knowing that, let's try to solve a problem here. As we can see, we have 2 triangles, and seeing as though these 2 corners are marked, we can say that this information is given to us that angle A and angle C are congruent. Now, does anyone else know what we can see on this triangle? Anyone? Raise your hands. What else do you see on here?
Line AB and line BC are parallel.
Right, the arrows, right? So that, like Caden said, means that these two lines are parallel to each other. And once again, since we didn't really do any work to get that, we put that down as given to us. Now, something that might be a little bit harder to catch on to, but is right there if you look at it, is that line DB and line BD are the same, meaning that they are congruent to each other using the reflexive property. Now, using the information we have here, we can conclude that angle CDB and angle ABD are congruent using alternate interior angles. Now we have enough information to solve this problem. Our conclusion from this problem is that triangle CDB is congruent to angle ABD using angle-angle side congruency. Angle-angle side congruency is defined as two triangles and the non-included side of a triangle being equal to the corresponding angles and sides of another triangle. As you can see over here, that definition matches up with what we have for a problem, meaning that we correctly solved this problem. But you may be thinking, how does this connect? I mean, you just went from parallel lines to triangle congruency. Well, that's not quite the case. What I did is I explained parallel lines, and then I explained triangle congruency, but I used the parallel lines, something we learned in the past, and brought it forward to help us with something new that we're doing now. This is similar to how not only can you learn from your mistakes in the past, but you can learn from things you did right as well. Now, you may be thinking, look, this is great. We know why being stuck in the past is bad, but what can we do to move on from the past? Well, my product is a poster I made after consulting my experts, and it's hung up around BrainWorks. There's one over there. They're all over BrainWorks, and after consulting my experts, like a common thing that they both said was that accepting the past for what it was is the first step in moving on from it. So that's up there, and I also consulted them on what options would be the best in taking steps to move on from the past, which I have listed here. You might also notice the quote, win or learn, down here. This is a quote taken from my expert, Dr. Brownell. This is a horrible picture of him, and I feel really bad, but he said in our interview, it's win or learn. You either create a memory or a valuable lesson. So, what I want you to take away from all this is to take your present, your past, and your future in stride, and don't let yesterday take up too much of today. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Alrighty. Ash, I always enjoy your presentations. You have a really good presentation style. You seem exceptionally comfortable up there. You're very engaging. Your math integration was really, really clever. And I liked everything about it. I liked how you developed it. I liked how you had that proof come up. You went back and forth to the picture. I like how you even asked other people, hey, what do you notice? So it's a great way to try to get your audience a little bit engaged in there. But then the way you made the connection, like you made it clear, like, okay, so why did I just do that? Oh, let me make this so obvious to you. And it was a really clever way to go, hey, yeah, we learned parallel lines. We know what they are, but look, now they're coming back again, and we're using them to help us move forward with something new. That was a really cool demonstration of how we don't have to ignore what happened in the past. It can still define who we are and moving forward, but we're not going to just spend our whole time in parallel lines. We're going to start to learn new things too. So I thought that was really creative. So good job. And we could stop the time so it doesn't interrupt us. Thank you.
Ash, you made a cool move here, and I don't know if it was intentional, if it's just how you work, but I like the way it seems to work is every time I looked at the Promethean board, there was like a quote or a statistic or some source on it, and like that's really cool. And so you have this division where it's like you as the presenter have some content knowledge and you're talking about it and you're very fluid when you talk about it, very comfortable, and then you have the stuff that backs you up, literally at your back, right at the Promethean boards, to reinforce what you're saying. And I think that divides things really well. So we look to you for moving us along, making the points, and we look to the Promethean board to kind of find out, okay, what's the evidence for this. I think that really works, and I think it's your strongest one, like because of that. Gatsby was really cool. I think you could add a little bit more to it just to see the textures, to feel the weight of it all, but you made all the perfect and right moves. So if you do that exactly sort of again, and let us savor it a little bit more before moving on. I know you have a lot of other stuff to cover. It'll really hit home, and I'm proud of this, and I'm excited for what you did here. Nice job.
Yeah, you did some cool things, and there's always creative aspects to your presentations, and I like how you kind of started with the counter argument, and then I also like how you incorporated your community expert into your product. I thought that was kind of cool. As far as science, I think you did a good job. The only thing is, like, when you're going from content to content, you're sometimes connecting, you're transitioning from content to the next content instead of transitioning from like back to your thesis, okay? So I would recommend like maybe going back to your thesis after your contents and reminding us, why did you do that content? But other than that, that's you got a lot of really good things here. Nice job.
Yeah, your history was solid. You had a lot of great sources and a lot of background information. You covered a lot within the World War II Japanese population and their struggles, which was great. My feedback was kind of similar to Welsh. I think at times your integrations got a little lost in their connection to the thesis, so more intentionally going back to your thesis regularly will help to solidify that for the audience. And then I think that I love that you incorporated your expert interview into your product, but consider how you can make your product a bit more impactful. I think at this time, like, not everyone sees the posters that are up, and I think you have a really great message. So I feel like just thinking about the impact of your product, because I think what you presented was really valuable. Good job.